All right, let's get to Ukraine. Zelensky in town at the General Assembly. Poland just announced that they're going to no longer provide any more weapons. I think Zelensky's up in Canada right now, actually talking to their
Trudeau,
to Trudeau, and I think maybe he's going to address their parliament. I'm not quite sure about that, but address just like where we're at, what are the implications of Poland, and like what do you think is going on here? Because it is there is a dropping support for continuing armament. We've been, this has been escalating in terms of how much money and how much support we're giving. Give us your perspective on this.
I mean, I think a quick take on Poland is just remember they've got an election in a few weeks. So, I mean, that is playing a role here. I mean, Poland has been actually extremely supportive, even though they got a very right-leaning government. I mean, the Poles have been very, very generous to the Ukrainian neighbors and sort of in terms of bringing them in, providing a place for them, accepting all these refugees. There's issues with regard to Ukraine's grain shipments, which are competing with Polish grain. The Poles have allowed the grain to transit Poland, but they don't want it to, to be sold in the Polish market. So there's a few things going on here, but yes, it also has to do with some, I guess, questions and some exhaustion on where is this war going. But in general, I think that the way that Poland has handled the influx of Ukrainian refugees and the war in general has been fairly admirable.
And so, is it going to have implications on? I mean, are there ending of military support? Is that going to have broad implications? Like, how much military support would they provide?
I mean, some, not a lot. And what I've heard from folks is like after the elections, they will probably reverse that. Who knows what will happen? But of course, the vast majority of military aid is coming from the United States and other countries in Europe. But it's as a political message, it's one we should take note of.
Give us your perspective on the. I mean, I think the perspective on the war is fairly straightforward. Russia invaded, and Ukraine is pushing them at least back. How much do you know? How much territory since we started providing aid? How much territory has Ukrainians regained? I mean, like, how effective has this been? Because a lot of people were saying on day one that when the United States was starting to provide aid, we shouldn't do this. We should settle for a negotiated settlement right now. You can't win, and that's it.
As of last year, I mean, the Ukrainians have taken back some 50% of what the Russians controlled at one point. That includes last year's counteroffensive and this year's counteroffensive, which has been moving much slower. There's a number of reasons for that. I think everyone was amazed and impressed by what the Ukrainians were able to achieve last year, about a year ago, especially in cities like Kherson. But what happened in those where you had Russian troops that were not dug in, they were fairly green. A lot of them just fled. That's not to take anything away from the Ukrainians who fought bravely. But a year later, the Russians are much more dug in. They've created much more layered minefields, and it's just much slower going for the Ukrainians, but they are slowly making progress. Obviously, the Ukrainians are telling their story about what they've been trying to do. We've been seeing some leaked criticisms from the Biden administration about, the pace of this or the way that they are or are not able to kind of integrate forces and to make greater gains. But there's no question that it's going much, much slower than a year ago.
So, and overall, like, I mean, is this something from your perspective that we should be doing? Is there a limiting principle on this?
Well, I think the Biden administration, and in my view, rightly, have always, they've been clear about what they want to see here, and that's Ukraine to take back control of their country and for Russia to stop the war. But they've also been fairly restrained and careful about the amount and quality of military assistance they've been giving, because Putin has nuclear weapons, and we do want to be careful that we don't trigger a nuclear war. Some people criticize him for that. I think that's entirely reasonable. I don't want to die in a nuclear war. The Ukrainians don't want to die in a nuclear exchange. But all along the way, as the Ukrainians have tested these ideas, Putin has not responded or escalated as some initially feared. We've seen multiple, you all saw the news about Elon Musk turning off Starlink because he did not want to enable an attack on Sevastopol. We've seen multiple attacks on Sevastopol by the Ukrainians, including, the night before I arrived in Kiev last week. And we didn't see any kind of escalation or particular escalation by the Russians in response to that.
Okay, so what did you see when you were in Kiev?
Yeah. What I saw in Kiev was a city that the war was almost not in evidence. Ukraine is very well protected by anti-aircraft, by Patriot missile batteries, anti-missile batteries. Certainly you saw soldiers around. You saw certain areas of the city, but only a few closed off. You saw patriotic posters and slogans, though I was interested to see that there is no Zelensky cult of personality. I don't think I saw a single poster with Zelensky's face on it. You saw just Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian civilians, and slogans like "Let's pull together, let's win this." But this is a city that is, people are out, people are walking around, people are having fun. And what I heard from a lot of Ukrainians, just kind of unanimously, that the invasion in 2022 triggered a renaissance of Ukrainian culture across the board, like more restaurants, more culture, more music, more unity, more, and the irony, of course, is this is exactly what Putin was trying to clamp down on and prevent and erase, which was the Ukrainian nation. And this is not unique to Ukraine. I mean, you see people responding like this in similar situations.
Will you just turn your mic directly to pull it down just a little bit more? Yeah, right.
There we go.
Okay.
So, okay, and do you have a sense, though, of broadly, let's say the United States was to stop all aid. Obviously, the Ukrainians would be much more susceptible to Russia. But what would happen? Would the next day, would they sue for peace, as it were? Or, would Russia just continue to roll through? Why? What I don't understand is, I understand the theory that if we provide less aid, that the Ukrainians will have to, at one point, negotiate for peace because they won't have the ability at one point to wage the type of, the defense that they've been waging.
Yeah.
Presumably they would go to some type of underground, asymmetrical warfare. But what would be the limiting principle for Russia in that instance to say why would they say okay, now we'll sue for peace, as opposed to actually we're just going to roll through the rest of the country.
That's the key point.
Yeah.
I mean, Putin to this day has given no evidence that he's interested in any kind of negotiation that the Ukrainians could possibly accept. I think a lot of people say it's a cliche, partly because it's true, but I think people understand that at some point there will be a negotiation. The Ukrainians, quite rightly, justified according to international law, they want 100% of their country back. If and when Putin indicates that he wants to actually negotiate something short of that, which he has not yet done, I think the Biden administration and others are going to take a look at that. They want to be clear publicly for now. We are standing behind the Ukrainians. We're not pressing them to negotiate away their country. But as of now, that's not a decision they have to make because Putin has not given any sign that he's remotely interested in that negotiation.
What about reports that the U.S. has inhibited Ukraine from negotiating at different times?
I don't see. I haven't seen any evidence of that.
Did Boris Johnson?
This is one of those things that kind of goes around. That there was a deal on the table, and then Boris Johnson showed up and was like, "Yeah, don't do that," and they were like, "Okay, we won't do that." It's the story, as is often the case, is much more complex. You had this negotiation going on, I think it was April of 2022 in Istanbul with Ukrainian representatives, Russian representatives. It was unclear how much authority the Russian representatives actually had from Putin. There were the kind of broad outlines of a deal. But again, it's not like they were about to sign and Boris, Johnson showed up and said, you know what, nah, don't do it. So it's unclear whether that could have even come to fruition. But it's also worth noting in that period is when Bucha was taken back. This was a town that was occupied by the Russians, and just mass atrocities were discovered there. And that not only did that inflame Ukrainian public opinion and make it much more difficult to sign any deal, even if a deal had been in the offing out of that. It also made clear to Ukrainians what their colleagues, their fellow citizens in the other occupied territories were facing. And to sign a deal that would consign Ukrainians to that fate was something that was just not doable.
When you say that the confines or like the outlines of a deal would Ukrainians obviously want 100% of their territory back. What is the sentiment around the Donbass? That's not included in that 100%?
It is.
Oh, it is.
That is, pre, 1991 Ukraine.
That
includes Crimea. It does.
Yeah.
There's no denying that'll be difficult. But again, as a matter of international law, we should recognize that is justified. But if we do get to a point, and once again, I think the onus is on Putin to indicate any, interest in a negotiation. I mean, we can address it then, but I don't think we need to start negotiating amongst ourselves before we see those signs.
Right. Of course, you would ask for 100% as a starting point, because otherwise you're never going to get more than what you ask for at the beginning in this situation. So what is the U.S. policy in reality? In other words, like, how much is it? It's going to be. It basically is enough to maintain the ability of the Ukrainians to make some progress. It's essentially just to make sure. I mean, this is basically like a war of attrition. There doesn't seem to be any other sort of solution here. It's just a question of where the parties are at that when we reach attrition.
Well, I think it's part of it is judging what the Ukrainians, what equipment they can kind of assimilate at any given time, and they've shown a great ability, tactically, to use new equipment, to train on it, to integrate it into their approach. But you have hawkish critics of Biden who've been saying from the beginning, just give them everything, give it everything, and the truth is they just can't learn on this stuff.
Absorb
we've been giving, and again, I think Biden and his team deserve some credit for they're watching this closely and okay, we're going to give them greater equipment, different kinds of equipment at a pace that they can actually learn on it, train on it, because this stuff does take a lot of time to learn how to use and to integrate it into the war.
And is there any chance we would get to the point where Putin would say, I'm interested in negotiating for real prior to the election? It just seems so hard to imagine that without there being some type of major, upheaval in Russia, that there is a circumstance where Putin would not wait to see the outcome of the 2024 election.
I think that's right. And, who knows what information Putin is getting? That's always a question. I mean, how does he see the war? Which advisors is he listening to? What information are they afraid to tell him? Or, what does he understand about the war? And what could we do or the Ukrainians do that could possibly shift that strategic calculation? And
that's actually not that's not such a sort of a given as to what he's getting, because he clearly, it seems to me, I mean, and tell me if my assessment of this is wrong. It looked to me like the Biden administration was not prepared to provide any aid to Ukraine once this invasion started, until it became clear that everyone had overestimated Russia's ability and simultaneously underestimated Ukraine's ability to repel Russia, but overestimated Russia's ability to, because it seemed to me like the Biden administration was under the impression that this is going to be like a 8-day war, and then Ukraine is going to have a leadership that is essentially installed more or less by Putin. And Putin, I think, thought that too, and which begs the question of is it even possible for him to get the real idea of what's going on there? Is he even able to make an assessment?
Yeah, I mean, again, going back to what I said, I mean, who knows what information he's getting? What I heard from some folks over there is the initial invasion, they determined that the Russians were actually using Soviet-era maps, because they were striking like, manufacturing plants that had been abandoned for 2 decades because those used to be kind of arms manufacturing plants back in the Soviet days. But what you said about, what the Biden administration thought, I would also note here, and this I think goes to, some who have claimed that, Biden wanted this, it was his NATO provocation, we kind of goaded Putin into this. Biden wanted to park the U.S.-Russia relationship over here. They had this, summit in 2021. The goal was to say, listen, we're not going to have a great relationship with Putin, but we kind of just want to park the relationship, see if we can just manage it. Putin obviously had other ideas. But I think we saw, a number of high-level, administration officials like Bill Burns, the CIA chief, who's also kind of the unofficial special envoy for tough things. They send him wherever things are really hard, to go over to Russia and actually talk to Putin and his team. You saw like Macron, you had Schultz from Germany going over there, essentially putting NATO on the table in so many words, not directly, but that was clearly part of the conversation. So
what do you mean by that? Like saying like we're willing to ramp down NATO?
You're saying we're willing to, do as much as we can to address Russia's strategic concerns, strategic defense concerns. Now, one can argue that, well, they should have just come right out and said Ukraine won't be part of NATO. I am given, what Putin himself has described as the kind of grandiose objectives and grievances that kind of undergird this invasion. I'm skeptical that even doing that would have been enough for Putin, but it is clear that the United States and its allies were willing to talk about that in some respect.
Well, because, that is taking Putin's protestations about NATO and his justification for the invasion a little bit too at face value in that sense, because obviously what this invasion and this war has done has only ramped up NATO's power, given the additions of Finland and Sweden.
Right. No, Finland with the longest, European land border with Russia, now a member of NATO. I've kind of described the NATO, Russia's concern with NATO as, 10 feet of bridge for 100 feet of chasm. It's one of Putin and Russia's concerns and grievances, but there are so many others. You just have to read or listen to Putin's speeches when he talked about, Ukrainians aren't a real nation, they're just Russians and all of that.
What was your perspective on NATO before this, and has your perspective on it changed?
Initially, you don't have to just listen to Putin about Russian concerns about NATO. You even had people like Bill Burns, you had former Defense Secretary Bill Perry, and all kinds of American officials who had engaged with the Russians, post-Cold War, who understood that, the growth of NATO was a real concern for Russia. But, even saying that, I think this idea that the U.S. is just using NATO as a tool of imperialism, when we say NATO expansion, it's like, well, these countries want to join a defense alliance with the United States. That's not to say there aren't other drivers here. Certainly there are benefits to America's military industrial complex. We should be conscious of that. We should be conscious of, okay, it's a defensive alliance. What is that? What is it in defense of? It needs to be in defense of healthy, vibrant democracies. So, security alliances are good, but, the question is, what are they for? Has your perspective on the utility of NATO changed? Probably a little bit. I think everyone has taken note of, Putin has been very careful not to attack any countries in NATO. Right. And even the addition of Finland and Sweden to NATO after Putin, claimed this as a central concern, the Russian response to that was very muted. So there is a particular obsession with
if they were Ukraine. Trying to get NATO to go away.
Oh, right.
Poor job.
Oh, no, on both counts, whether it's the growth of NATO or kind of crushing Ukrainian nationalism, both of those have been a spectacular failure.
Yeah.
All right. So last question, though, on Ukraine anyways. There's this weird relationship. I don't know, weird is the right word, but there's this sort of like paradoxical relationship with essentially with the U.S. and China and Russia, because on one hand, like the U.S. has been building up to be somewhat antagonistic to China since, at least my understanding is, at least during the Obama administration, when we made the Asian pivot
Which we wanted to do, though, even before 9/11, right? There were a lot of.
I mean,
designs on that.
I've told this story many times at least that, like, the Gary Hart told us about the back in 04, told us about the, like, sort of the 21st century threats to the United States, and the story about I think it was Liz Cheney or Lynn Cheney sitting on a committee talking about China at that time.
Yeah, Washington was teeing up China. If you remember the Hainan Island incident where the U.S. plane was knocked down over, I mean, that was, we were getting close to that.
I think the whole project for a new American century was
Quite right.
about the idea of making sure that China does not become a superpower so that we can maintain our hyperpower status, et cetera, et cetera.
It was also about slotting China in for the now defunct Soviet Union.
Right,
and
right.
when 9/11 happened, they're like, nope, here, we're going to slot terrorism in there.
And so, but it seems that, like, the quicker this gets resolved, the less like an alliance between China and Russia has time to sort of, or a reason to develop in the same way, right? I mean, I don't know what Russia offers China as much as China certainly could offer Russia, it seems to me.
Oh, clearly. I mean, the way it's been put to me by multiple people is that Russia is on the way, if not already, kind of a vassal state of China. I mean, China has moved in as businesses fled Moscow in the wake of the invasion. Chinese state-connected businesses have moved in literally into those same offices in Moscow. So, there is, it's not, I wouldn't quite call it a patron-client relationship yet, but it seems to be kind of heading that way. Although, listen, Russia, clearly has, a lot of resources it can still use. It is not helpless. It is not entirely dependent, although it is becoming more dependent.
How does India fit into this? I mean, what is their relationship with Russia and China in this way?
I mean, they continue to trade with both to some consternation. Clearly, the Biden administration, and again, let's just step back. I mean, the Biden administration sees foreign policy, global affairs, almost entirely through the lens of strategic competition with China. I mean, that is the kind of way to understand everything they're doing. Again, I agree with their policy in Ukraine. I don't have any illusions that they're doing the right thing in Ukraine for my reasons. Right. They see it consistent for now with strategic competition with China. They make speeches about democracy and defending international law. Those things tend to go by the wayside when it comes to countries like Saudi Arabia or India, because those countries are seen as useful partners or necessary partners in competition with China.